the sweetest, most caring little girl in the whole world. It will be. My heart.
It was Thanksgiving night in Rochester, New York, 1984. Families across the city were gathered in warm kitchens, sharing meals, laughter, and gratitude. The streets were quiet, touched by the cold November air, as children played outside before returning home to leftovers and pie. But in one home, the Jerome family's holiday was about to take a dark and irreversible turn. 14-year-old Wendy Jerome had been celebrating the holiday with her mother, Denise. Wendy was known as a lively, kind-hearted teenager with bright brown eyes and a wide smile. She had a habit of going out of her way to make others feel special. And on this particular night, she had one simple task in mind. She wanted to deliver a birthday card to a close friend who lived just a few blocks away. It was the kind of errand that seemed perfectly harmless. The neighborhood was familiar, the distance was short, and Wendy was mature enough to handle it. Her mother, Denise, didn't think twice when Wendy mentioned it. She trusted her daughter to make the short trip safely. After all, what danger could there be in walking down the street on a holiday evening in a close-knit neighborhood? But hours later, Denise realized something was wrong. Her daughter had not returned home, and the silence in the house became unbearable. At first, she tried to rationalize. Maybe Wendy had stopped to chat with friends, or maybe she had gotten distracted. But as time ticked by, worry quickly shifted into fear. Denise called the police, and within hours, a search was underway. Neighbors joined in, armed with flashlights, combing the streets and calling Wendy's name. The sense of community was strong. Everyone wanted to help. Everyone wanted to believe Wendy would be found safe. But deep down, Denise felt an icy dread she couldn't shake. The search continued into the evening, and before long, officers made a devastating discovery. Just blocks from Wendy's home, in an alcove behind a school, her body was found. She had been brutally beaten, raped, and left exposed in the freezing air. The joyful holiday atmosphere instantly dissolved into horror. For Denise, the news shattered her world. Her 14-year-old daughter, her only child, was gone in the most violent way imaginable. The questions came in a rush. How could this happen? Who could do something so monstrous? And why Wendy? The answers would not come quickly, and for years, they would not come at all. The Rochester Police Department immediately launched an intensive investigation. Detectives processed the crime scene meticulously, collecting biological samples, fingerprints, and fibers. The brutality of the attack suggested rage, power, and control. Whoever had done this wanted to dominate and destroy. But in 1984, forensic science was limited. DNA testing was not yet a standard tool in law enforcement. Investigators could collect biological evidence, but they had no way of linking it to a specific individual unless that person was caught and compared directly. The science that would later revolutionize criminal justice simply didn't exist yet. Detectives turned to traditional methods. They interviewed dozens of people, friends, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen Wendy that night. Leads came in quickly, but most went nowhere. There were no credible eyewitnesses who had seen Wendy after she left home. The community, once bound by safety and trust, was suddenly paralyzed by fear. Parents clutched their children tighter, warning them not to walk anywhere alone. Rumors spread about possible suspects, strangers in cars, known troublemakers, or men with violent histories. But every lead seemed to collapse under scrutiny. Investigators built a list of potential suspects, but one by one, each was cleared. Polygraph tests, interviews, and alibis chipped away at the possibilities. Forensic tests on fibers and fingerprints didn't match anyone in their files. The killer seemed to have vanished into thin air. Despite the lack of progress, the case remained a top priority. Detectives reviewed evidence repeatedly, hoping to catch something they had missed. Cold case units were not yet a formal concept, but officers refused to let Wendy's file collect dust. Her photo stayed pinned to bulletin boards, a reminder of a crime left unsolved. For Denise, The pain never eased. Every Thanksgiving became a reminder of the night her daughter never came home. Birthdays passed without candles. Holidays without her laughter. The grief was heavy, but what made it worse was the lack of justice. Over the years, Wendy's case was revisited again and again. By the 1990s, DNA profiling had become a powerful new weapon in law enforcement. Investigators re-examined the evidence, testing biological samples from the crime scene. For the first time, they had a clear DNA profile of the killer. But the breakthrough didn't mean answers. The profile was uploaded into CODIS, the national DNA database, and no match was found. This meant the killer had never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection. He had stayed under the radar for years, and the database remained silent. Detectives grew frustrated, but never gave up. They kept the DNA on file, updating the system whenever technology advanced. The evidence was strong. It could identify the killer instantly if a match was made, but until then, the case remained frozen. Meanwhile, Denise lived in a cruel limbo. She became an advocate for her daughter, speaking publicly about Wendy and demanding justice. Her resilience inspired others, but behind her strength was a grief that never left her. She often said the hardest part was not knowing who had done it or why. By the 2000s, cold case units had become more sophisticated. Advances in DNA analysis allowed for more sensitive testing, sometimes extracting profiles from degraded evidence. But in Wendy's case, the original DNA sample remained the key. The problem wasn't quality, it was the lack of a match. In 2020, everything changed. Investigators, unwilling to let Wendy's case slip into obscurity, turned to a new tool: familial DNA searching. Unlike traditional DNA matching, which requires an exact match, this method looks for relatives of a possible suspect. It had already been used to solve other cold cases, most famously, the Golden State Killer. When Wendy's DNA evidence was run through familial searching, the results were stunning. The system flagged a partial match to a man who was not the killer himself, but was genetically related. This gave investigators a starting point they had never had before. By tracing family trees, detectives zeroed in on one man, Timothy Williams. Williams was living in Florida at the time. Back in 1984, he had been a teenager in Rochester, the same city where Wendy lived. He wasn't on anyone's radar during the original investigation, and he had never been charged with violent crimes. But the DNA evidence now pointed directly to him. Detectives tracked Williams carefully, building their case. They obtained a discarded DNA sample, something like a used cup or utensil, and compared it to the profile from the crime scene. The match was conclusive. After 36 years, they had finally found Wendy's killer. The arrest sent shockwaves through Rochester. For decades, people had wondered if the murderer was someone in their midst, someone walking freely among them. Now they knew it was Timothy Williams, a man who had managed to live quietly, undetected, while Wendy's family suffered. The cold case had finally cracked. When the DNA results came back, investigators knew they were staring at the moment they had waited nearly 4 decades for. The evidence left no doubt. Timothy Williams was the man responsible for the brutal murder of 14-year-old Wendy Jerome in 1984. After years of dead ends, this was the name, the face, and the truth that had eluded Rochester detectives for so long. But with the revelation came new questions. Who was Timothy Williams, and how had he escaped suspicion for all these years? Williams was 56 years old when police closed in on him. He had been living in Florida, far removed from the streets of Rochester, where Wendy's life was stolen. To neighbors, he was quiet, ordinary, and largely unremarkable. Hardly the profile of a man capable of such horrific violence. But the DNA told a different story, one that could not be denied. In November 2000, officers from both Florida and New York coordinated the arrest. It was a calculated operation, one that required precision and secrecy. Williams had no idea that investigators had been building their case against him, tracing his family tree and linking him to Wendy's murder. When they finally moved in, he was stunned. The arrest made national headlines. A case that had haunted Rochester for 36 years was suddenly thrust back into the spotlight. Families who had lived in fear back in 1984 were now reliving those memories, grappling with the fact that the killer had been identified. For Wendy's mother, Denise, the moment was bittersweet. On one hand, she had the answer she had prayed for since that terrible Thanksgiving night. She finally knew who had taken her daughter's life. But on the other hand, the revelation was a painful reminder of all the years Wendy had been gone. Justice was here, but nothing could bring her daughter back. Williams was extradited to New York, where he would stand trial for the murder. Documents laid out the evidence. The biological material recovered from Wendy's body in 1984 matched Timothy Williams with scientific certainty. There was no mistake, no ambiguity, no shadow of doubt. The science was ironclad. Still, the justice system required its process. Williams was charged with second-degree murder, and preparations for trial began. The courtroom would become the stage where nearly 4 decades of grief, frustration, and perseverance collided. For Denise, this was the moment she had waited her entire life to see. As the trial unfolded, prosecutors painted a vivid picture of the crime. They described Wendy's final moments, the errand to deliver a birthday card, the sudden attack, the violence she endured. The details were haunting, even after all these years. For jurors, it was impossible not to feel the weight of Wendy's absence in that courtroom. Prosecutors leaned heavily on the DNA evidence, the cornerstone of their case. Experts testified about how the profile had been preserved, how it was tested, and how it led investigators to Timothy Williams. The science was explained in painstaking detail, leaving little room for doubt. This was not circumstantial evidence. This was direct proof of guilt. Williams's defense team faced an uphill battle. They attempted to cast doubt on the reliability of DNA evidence, suggesting mishandling or contamination. But the prosecution reminded jurors that the sample had been safeguarded for decades and tested with modern techniques. The chain of custody was airtight, and the results were conclusive. As the trial progressed, emotional testimonies added depth to the case. Detectives who had worked tirelessly on Wendy's file took the stand, describing the frustration of chasing dead ends for decades. Some had retired and returned to testify, still haunted by the memory of that Thanksgiving night in 1984. Their voices cracked with emotion as they recalled their promise to never give up. But the most powerful testimony came from Denise. She faced the man accused of murdering her daughter and spoke about the impact of Wendy's loss. Her words painted a picture of a life stolen too soon, a teenager who would never grow up, marry, or start a family of her own. Her grief was raw, but her strength was undeniable. The jury deliberated, weighing the mountain of evidence against the defense's attempts at doubt. For them, the answer was clear. In early 2024, Timothy Williams was found guilty of 3 counts of second-degree murder. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. The conviction brought a wave of relief to the community. After nearly 40 years, Rochester could finally close one of its most haunting chapters. Neighbors who had lived with unanswered questions now had closure. But no one felt the impact more deeply than Denise. When Williams was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, Denise spoke publicly about her daughter. Through tears, she said, "This door is closed." Her words carried both finality and sorrow. Justice had been served, but the cost was unbearable. Wendy would never come back, but her killer would never walk free again. The sentencing marked the end of a journey that had spanned generations. Detectives who had once been young rookies were now retired veterans. Technology that didn't even exist in 1984 had become the key to unlocking the truth. And a mother who had waited nearly 4 decades finally had her answer. The Wendy Jerome case stands as a powerful example of persistence and innovation in criminal justice. It shows how science can give a voice to the voiceless, even decades after their lives have been stolen. It proves that no matter how much time passes, the truth has a way of surfacing. And it reminds us that cold cases are never truly closed. But it also raises uncomfortable questions. How many other killers are still out there, living quiet lives, hidden in plain sight? How many families are still waiting for their Wendy Jerome moment, the breakthrough that finally brings justice? And how many cases remain unsolved, waiting for technology to catch up? For Denise, the pain will never fully fade. But she takes comfort in knowing her daughter's case helped advance the use of DNA in solving cold cases. Wendy's story is now part of a larger fight for justice, a reminder that perseverance matters. Her life, though tragically cut short, continues to make an impact. As the courtroom closed and the cameras faded, one truth remained. Wendy Jerome's name would never be forgotten. Her story would continue to echo, not just in Rochester, but in every community that has lost someone to violence. And her case would stand as proof that justice delayed is not always justice denied. For investigators, the lesson was clear: never give up. For families, the message was one of hope. Answers can come even decades later. And for society, it was a reminder of the power of science to rewrite history. And so, the story of Wendy Jerome closes with both heartbreak and triumph. A young girl lost in 1984 finally received justice in 2024. Her family and her community can finally begin to heal. But the echoes of her case will continue to inspire the pursuit of truth in countless others. Because behind every cold case file, there is a family waiting. Behind every piece of evidence, there is a victim longing for justice. And behind every unsolved murder, there is hope that science will one day reveal the truth. For Wendy Jerome, that day finally came. But as we celebrate the justice finally served in Wendy's case, we must ask, how many other families are still waiting for their miracle? How many more hidden killers live quietly in our neighborhoods, believing they've escaped forever? The story of Wendy Jerome, he proves they can run, they can hide, but the truth always waits. And the question remains, which cold case will be the next to finally break wide open?
I just wish my husband had been alive to see this. He passed away in 2011, and I know he's up there with her.